Hello, YouTube. As you can see, it's January 4th, 2023. Alright, so I hope this finally gets rid of it for good. This common problem that keeps coming up for me that I have to deal with on here. It seems that no matter how hard I try, I just can't convince people that this theory doesn't make sense. That the theory of time travel makes sense. I mean, it does not make sense, okay? The time travel doesn't make sense, okay? I've debunked it a number of different ways on this channel. And in doing so, I've actually debunked major world religions, which rely on the time travel paradox for their quote-unquote God. Because they say, oh, well, a God would be able to, time travel, and that would be a totally logical process. There'd be nothing illogical about time travel. Well, I mean, I beg to differ. I mean, first of all, right? They think that their God, especially Christian in this case, they think that a God would time travel by traveling through space, and that space is one with time, but not in the way talked about in the theory of general relativity by Einstein. No. Not just in that way. They think it's also in another way. See, they think most people in history have bought into this convoluted concept of time or perception of time that is a pop culture perception of it, because they're so brainwashed and stupid. But they really think that time is something you can touch or something. They think it's like a physical thing. It's a location, when in fact it is not. I mean, some of them don't think this, but they really just say it just to troll. Pathetically, of course, but still. Either way, they actually, there are many people. Look, there is many things in these popular religions that support this notion being what they think. They think that, you can travel through time because it's a location. Well, they think that that's what it is. They think time is a location. Well, if they think that, they must be using misinterpreting what general relativity says, because nowhere does general relativity actually say that time is a location. I mean, just because it says space-time doesn't mean that it's saying that space is time. It's just saying that they're aligned. That throws a lot of people off because they're so uneducated and stupid. But the point is, I mean, you can't travel through time as if it's a location, because it's not a location. You cannot travel through time. You cannot travel inside of time. And that's kind of the biggest problem with general relativity. Every time people present the theory, they always present it as if the original intention behind the theory was actually to argue that time is a location that you can travel inside of. When in fact that was never what it was written to say. It was just written to say that that time and space are aligned. So it throws a lot of people off. They must be assuming that Einstein actually thought that time is space and that space is time, when that's not what he actually thought, and that's not what the original theory says. It's just that people did not have the good judgment to realize that Einstein would never say such a stupid thing, and that nobody would be stupid enough to actually believe that space is time merely because Einstein said so, or some wacko said so. But I mean, some people would, but very few people would. Now, of course, space is not time, but the sad reality is that most people in history have actually believed that space is time. The only problem is they have not been aware of the fact that this is what they believe. They only have believed this to be true. They only believe this. They only believe that space is time, but only in certain situations. They're not aware of it, though. You see, when it comes to their religion, they will actually use this idea that their religion says that space is time. But outside of their religion, they would say that notion is absurd. So here's the problem, right? For one example, and I think I've talked about this a little bit. before, in certain videos in the past about how their religions do say and argue that space is time. Because it says, well, their God travels through time through traveling through space. And so, well, no, it doesn't say their God travels through time through traveling through space. I'm mistaken. That is not what Christianity says, and it's not what major world religions say. But the religions do argue with this sort of logic that space is time, at least, which is the problem. It's a low level of reasoning. Their arguments also make no sense because, well, they say that their God can time travel. Not through traveling through space, of course, but through traveling outside of space. See, that's where the problem is. They presuppose that a god would travel outside of a space. But as I've talked about and given great evidence of many times, no matter how paradoxical the real God would be, it would never really travel in any sort of space. It would always just not be inside of anything and not be in a space and not exist inside of things. It would always that is to say, it wouldn't even exist outside, because it would not exist inside or outside. It would just exist at best. For a God as paradoxical as the real true creator of existence would be, which is also happens to be the one I've argued for on this channel. It would not be such an entity that it would actually travel inside of any location. So if it were not inside of our universe, it would not be inside of a location if it's not in our universe. And if that's the case, then it certainly would not be able to time travel, because if time is confined to the universe, and you can only exist temporally, you can only exist temporally, which is in a way that time flows. For if you're bound to time, it's only if you exist in a location. That isn't because time is space. It's just because they're aligned. See, people have to understand what time. They don't have a very fundamental understanding of the word time. I mean, they do have a fundamental understanding of it, but they don't understand it, the fundamentals of it, in a context as far as paradoxes go and the laws of logic. They understand how it works in some of physics and in some practical things in everyday life, of course, as I've already talked about. But as far as paradoxes go, if you don't exist, if you're not bound to time, then you are just not bound by logic. I've already talked about why time is a purely logical thing. So if you don't exist, so that's really the case, right? And obviously, if you don't, it would mean that if you don't exist, if you're not bound to time, and first of all, you don't exist, and second of all, you don't. I mean, you might be able to say you do exist. You might be able to make an argument for that, but you certainly would not exist in a logical way. At least not. Not in a totally logical way, not in a completely logical way. At best, in a 50% logical way. There'd be some things to your being that would be logical, and there'd be some things that make absolutely no sense at that point. I have talked about that in very recent videos. I've given implications and evidence of that in my most recent videos regarding just exactly how paradoxical would God be. So, because obviously, as I've talked about for a long time on this channel, I've been going back and forth and coming up with different, very varying opinions about just how paradoxical God is. Now, the most recent consensus, but it's always been that God is paradoxical on this channel, is what I've been saying. But of course, even so, either way, exactly how paradoxical is God? Could there be a God? Could God be somewhat paradoxical, but also somewhat not paradoxical? Or could it be that a God would be totally paradoxical, or would a God be not at all paradoxical. Well, again, I've never argued that a God would be non-paradoxical. I've always given shit tons and mountains of evidence for a very long time on this channel. A very, very long time. And so really all that's happened has been my changing opinion for the most part of just about exactly how paradoxical, how much of God is paradox and how much isn't. But ultimately, in the end, none of it really changes what I'm trying to talk about here. That's in the past. This is just a video to talk about why it really makes no sense to say that God exists in such a way where he exists in time, in our time, Well, I think that you could argue that he doesn't exist in our time, but if he does exist in any time, perhaps he would be able to time travel, But that was never really my argument, In fact, you can go back months ago to some of my videos where I talked about God and time travel, and in relation to his omnipotence. I've always been, and even back then, I was arguing that if God really wanted to, he could time travel, in the way shown in science fiction, not just in some of the definitions and meanings of the word time travel, but really even in the most paradoxical ways. God would actually be able to time travel, the ways in science fiction. But the thing is, what I'm trying to run home here isn't about that. I'm trying to give, because I've already explained why many times a long time ago as to why that is. What I'm trying to talk about in this video is why, and give better evidence of in this video, rather, is why it is that if God did time travel, why that would be a very paradoxical thing to do. Because if you now here's why that is. Traveling itself is not an illogical thing, Travel is a logical process, but to be able to travel to different points in time, despite the fact that those different moments of history are not located, not different locations. They're, first of all, there's not an infinite number of different locations for every single moment of history. Because if there was, that would be the only way to time travel as depicted in science fiction. Every single moment of history would have to create its own specific location of each moment, and each one would be contingent upon the other. And so, if you want to go back 10 seconds ago, there's a location for that you can go back to. And if you wanted to go back 30 seconds ago, you could go back to that location. But they'd have to be different locations from not only from the present, but from each other. And so even in science fiction, this is what that's kind of what's implied and shown. Except in science fiction, they kind of try to brush that under the rug by trying to conflate and equivocate each and every past moment into one location. Like 10 seconds ago and 20 seconds ago are merged into one location. So if you go back, 10 years, you'd be able to conveniently live through a long time of that location to reach the present. But more realistically, even if there was the time travel as depicted in science fiction, every single past moment would have to be a separate location just for each one. So if you went back to one past moment, that would be it, and then you do that past moment, and then what? How are you going to get to the next one then? The next past moment. So there's that aspect of it. I mean, I suppose you could say, if that, I mean, then again, if time travel really was possible as according to science fiction, and that was how it worked, God of course would have to be the one to make it work that way. And if God really did actually resort to that, there'd have to be a good reason, justifiable reason for it. And so really all this says is that if there was a scenario, in such a scenario, and this is really a hypothetical, whimsical, imaginative scenario, right? Well, if this did happen, God would just create on a whim, one location, for every past moment, a location that where you go to that past moment. You literally go to every single past moment, right, that you want to go to, and then once you get there, it progresses. Every past moment progresses into the present, but there's an infinite number of past moments you can start at, starting points. So that's still a paradox to every other one, of course, especially, and not only that, but even on top of that, where would God even put these locations, might I ask? Because where other than the universe? But if they really are in our universe, well, I would think that the universe cannot contain that many infinite time fragments of history, reenactments. Reenactments, I would say. I mean, it would just be these perfect replica reenactments of everything that's already happened, scattered across the entire universe. I mean, you'd have to be putting universes. You actually have to be putting the size of our universe. You have to be putting replica universes within of our universe within our universe. It's not even going to happen mathematically because you can't put our universe inside of itself, especially not an infinite number of times over. But sci-fi time travel completely ignores that, of course. But if a god really wanted to make that happen, it would be able to do it and have it still make sense on some level. But a god would never resort to that, of course. But if a god really wanted to do it, I'd say yes. Our God, the true omnipotent paradoxical entity known as God, would be able to do it. But it never will or would, because it'd be arbitrary, given the fact that given the things I've talked about and proven about the sheer rationality, intelligence, and powers of God. Yeah. Now, of course, given that being the case, that already so many plot holes in this this idea of time travel. Like how would I guess still they are positing obviously they're positing a time traveling God, which is time traveling a paradoxical entity, of course. But the problem is, of course, that they still do not consider God to be paradoxical. These major world religions would still say that if God did do all those things I said earlier, that would not be paradoxes. They would just say that that's they would say it's completely logical. I mean, you could read this article. There's many like it. None of these supposed none of no the vast majority of people in history who've had religions have not really understood the criteria of what a paradox is, but because they never read about it or cared to, But even this article admits that many times over that it would be mathematical paradoxes. It would be there's just many paradoxes involved if you're actually positing time travel, especially if a god would be time traveling, because it would be even more arbitrary for a god to time travel than it would be for us anything confined to the universe to time travel. So yeah, I mean, I would take what they say about it with a grain of salt. Obviously, this is okay. So look, this isn't a now I will say this isn't a massive change or improvement from what I've already talked about as far as debunking the notion of time travel on my channel. Being perfectly logical anyway. I mean, I've talked about why it could happen, but it'd be extremely paradoxical to happen. But, but at the same time, I've always talked about why, if it were, why it is that if you really could time travel, you would absolutely have to have the aid of a god to do it. There's absolutely zero feasible way that, atoms can be used to create time travel without the aid of divine intervention or the aid of a god or our creator. So, I mean, this article does say otherwise to that. It does say argue the contrary to that, of course. As I take it, this was written by. You can read that part for yourself, but yeah, this is just one of countless articles like itself. Many in history, books, movies, all kinds of things, popular things that all have a similar opinions as expressed in this in that article. It's really not really a major improvement from what I've already said about time travel being paradoxical. The only thing I added in that I haven't before is that this aspect of it that I haven't explained, which is that the biggest problem to time travel, the best evidence, the most convincing evidence I can give as of now to the people, that time travel is paradoxical, is that it relies on getting outside of space itself. First of all, getting outside of space to travel to another space where the different time is, where a different timeline is, or a different time is, version of time is. First of all, let me just start off by saying there's many things wrong just right off in the beginning premise of traveling outside of space. I mean, you can't be outside of space and still travel, because at least not without it being a paradox. Because obviously, space is a location, and space in the universe is what is all of space, and so also the universe is all possible locations. So if you went outside of the universe, and you're going outside of all of space, and if you did that, you'd not be able to travel outside of it because there would be no outside. There is no location outside of, because obviously, and I reiterate again for the millionth time, there is no location outside of all possible locations. So for that, so if you really did time travel, to another timeline by going outside of the universe, going to an it already make no sense just by the fact that there is no outside of the universe. But if you were still outside of the universe, in a location outside of the universe that doesn't even exist, now from there, of course, you'd have to also somehow manage to find this other, version of time, and get into that location. No matter how hard it would be, you'd still have to do that. So that's how absurd it really is. I don't recall myself ever adding that last part in. So until I've talked about this. So that's how. So that's pretty much all there is to say for this video, aside from everything else. I hope that gives you an idea of just how absurd time travel would be without a god that could somehow make any paradox happen if it wanted to. And if it really had the power to do it, obviously the only way would be through such a god. Yeah, I mean, I do, now, of course, I still do think, though, that I'm as these it's very arguable, debatable about just how paradoxical God is. I understand that, but really the bigger thing to this video is not that. Like I said, it's about the fact that time travel is just very, very paradoxical on a number of levels. Because there's just, to ever achieve it, there'd have to be so many paradoxes by the laws of physics and by by the laws of physics and by the laws of logic. So if I were you, what I would do is I would really just not rely on what these popular religions say for, is as far as time travel goes, because it's really just completely unfounded science. It completely ignores all the plot holes I pointed out, as well as the plot holes this article and many others pointed out. So, but, that's about it for this video. Really hope you enjoyed. Please like, share, subscribe. This really probably will not be the last time I talk about this. I hope it is, but it probably won't be. So, but yeah, I'm out. Goodbye.